welcome back. Settle into your pillow, dim the lights if you haven't already, and let your shoulders drop. Tonight, we are spending our hours with a woman whose name has survived 5 centuries, though the real shape of her life has not survived nearly so well. Not the villain of a Tudor drama, not the single scandal she gets reduced to in a textbook footnote. A person, a full, complicated, remarkable person, who packed an entire lifetime of ambition, love, terror, and quiet defiance into roughly 3 decades. Her name was Anne Boleyn. She was Queen of England for barely 3 years, mother to the woman who would become England's greatest monarch. And whether she intended it or not, the reason an entire nation broke from the Roman Catholic Church forever. That is an enormous weight for one short life to carry. Tonight, we're going to carry it with her, slowly, from the very beginning to the very end. There is no need to hold onto every date or every name. Just let the story move over you like a tide, and if you drift off before we reach the end, that is exactly what this is for. It is the 1st of June, 1533. London sits beneath a heavy gray sky, the kind of sky that seems to be holding its breath. Every street along the route has been hung with cloth of gold and tapestry. Every window and rooftop is crowded with faces. The entire city has turned out for a spectacle unlike anything London has seen before, and it stretches for half a mile. Heralds, bishops, noblemen in crimson velvet, an entire river of ceremony flowing from the tower toward Westminster Abbey. At the very center of it, carried on a litter draped in white satin and silver cloth, rides a woman wrapped in ermine. Her dark hair falls loose over her shoulders. Her chin is lifted. She is somewhere in her early 30s, and within the hour, she will be crowned Queen of England. Her name, again, is Anne Boleyn. The litter sways gently with the movement of the horses. She can feel thousands of eyes on her. What she cannot feel, strangely, is any real warmth coming back from the crowd. There ought to be cheering. There ought to be the noise a coronation is supposed to produce, blessings shouted, caps thrown into the air. Instead, there is a strange, dense hush, broken only by the occasional jeer or muttered insult. Somewhere in the crowd, a cluster of men notice the royal cipher stitched into the banners overhead, an H entwined with an A for Henry and Anne, and they begin to laugh, turning the letters into a crude joke. The laughter spreads, and it is not the friendly kind. Inside the abbey, the noise of the street disappears into stone and incense. Thomas Cranmer, the newly appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, lowers the ancient crown of St. Edward onto her head. She is anointed with holy oil. She is, by every law the kingdom recognizes, England's rightful queen. And yet, kneeling there beneath the weight of that gold, she can still feel the silence of the streets clinging to her like smoke. How did a knight's daughter from a small manor in Kent end up here? And why does almost nobody outside these walls want to celebrate it? To answer that, we have to go all the way back to the beginning, to a child nobody thought to write down the birth date of, in a moated house surrounded by Kentish farmland, a family climbing, sometime around the turn of the 16th century. Historians still argue whether it was 1501 or as late as 1507, and the debate has never been settled. A daughter was born to Thomas Boleyn and his wife, Elizabeth Howard. It is a strange thing to admit about a woman who would go on to be one of the most scrutinized figures in English history. We cannot even say for certain how old she was when she died. That uncertainty is, in its own way, a fitting overture for a life defined by gaps in the record and arguments that never resolve. Thomas Boleyn came from a family that understood something essential about power. It is not inherited so much as constructed, generation by generation. His ancestors had been merchants and tradesmen in Norfolk, steadily working their way up into gentry status over 2 or 3 generations. Thomas himself became a skilled diplomat, fluent in French, useful to the crown, and trusted by Henry VI to carry sensitive messages across the Channel. His wife brought the bloodline his family still lacked. Elizabeth Howard was the daughter of the Duke of Norfolk, a title that placed her family among the very highest ranks of the English nobility. Between the two of them, Thomas and Elizabeth Boleyn were a couple with a plan, and the plan was always to climb higher. Their home was Hever Castle, a compact, moated manor in Kent, not a grand palace, but solid, defensible, and quietly ambitious, much like the family living inside it. 3 of their children survived to adulthood. There was Mary, the elder daughter, soft-featured and easygoing, who would eventually drift into scandal without seeming to try very hard at all. There was George, clever and charming, destined for a future no one at Hever could have imagined. And there was Anne, the middle child, who from a very young age was treated differently than most daughters of her class. Her parents did not intend for Anne to marry a local knight and vanish into rural obscurity. They intended to send her out into the great courts of Europe, where she could absorb languages, music, arithmetic, manners, and the particular kind of social intelligence that could not be taught at home, and then bring all of it back to elevate the Boleyn name. That plan set into motion in the spring of 1513, when Anne was around 12 years old. The courts of Burgundy and France. Thomas Boleyn used his diplomatic connections to secure his younger daughter a place in the household of Margaret of Austria, regent of the Low Countries, an extraordinary placement for a girl of the Boleyn's rank, and proof of just how skillfully Thomas played the political game. Margaret's court, based in the town of Mechlin, was among the most sophisticated in Europe, a center of art, humanist scholarship, music, and refined manners. It was, in every sense, the perfect place to shape a sharp, observant girl into something formidable. So in the spring of 1513, young Anne Boleyn said goodbye to the ducks paddling on the moat at Hever, and climbed into a carriage bound for the coast. She would not set foot in England again for nearly a decade. Margaret of Austria was herself a remarkable woman, twice widowed before the age of 24, and a capable, clear-eyed ruler in her own right, governing the Low Countries on behalf of her nephew, the future Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. She collected illuminated manuscripts, commissioned music, and gathered around her the sons and daughters of Europe's ambitious families, quietly training them in the art of usefulness without ever calling it training. Anne arrived as one of 18 young noble girls attached to the household, not simply attendants, but students in an unspoken curriculum of behavior. They learned dances, the lute, the virginals. They learned how to move through a formal banquet without ever looking uncertain. They studied French, a little Italian, a touch of Latin. They learned to write letters that flattered without groveling, to read a room, to listen far more than they spoke. Above all, they learned that a royal court is a stage, and that every gesture on it is watched, weighed, and remembered. What survives from this period is a single letter, written by Margaret herself to Thomas Boleyn in the summer of 1514. In it, the regent tells him that his daughter is so well-mannered and pleasant for her age that Margaret feels more indebted to him for sending her than he could possibly feel to Margaret in return. For a busy ruling regent to take the time to write something like that, unprompted, about a 13-year-old who had only just arrived, that tells us something. Anne was not simply keeping up. She was standing out. The intellectual atmosphere of Mechlin left its mark on her too. Margaret's court was steeped in Christian humanism, in correspondence with scholars like Erasmus, in ideas that were quietly radical for the time, that scripture belonged in the language ordinary people spoke, that the church could be renewed from within, that faith was ultimately a private matter between a person and God. Nobody sat Anne down and taught her these ideas directly. She simply breathed them in, the way a child absorbs whatever is in the air around her. They would lie dormant in her for years. They never disappeared. In the autumn of 1514, Anne's path shifted again. Henry VII's younger sister, another Mary Tudor, was being sent to France to marry the elderly King Louis XII, a political match wrapped in the language of romance. The young princess needed English ladies to accompany her, and Anne, already fluent in French and polished by 2 years at Margaret's court, was an obvious choice. She crossed into France, assuming it would be a long, settled position. It was not. Louis XII was 52, unwell, and eager for an heir from his teenage bride. Within 3 months of the wedding, he was dead. The unkind gossip of the time suggested that keeping pace with his young wife had finished him off. Mary Tudor, suddenly a dowager queen at 18, hurried home to marry the man she had wanted all along. But when the English retinue packed up to leave, Anne did not go with them. Her father arranged for her to remain in France, entering the household of the new queen. Claude, the quiet, devout wife of the dazzling young King Francis I. And so began 7 years at the French court. 7 years that would remake Anne Boleyn completely. Queen Claude's household was calmer than her husband's glittering circle, but it was no backwater. Claude was the daughter of Louis XII and Anne of Brittany, surrounded by fine tapestries, the newest poetry, and the most refined manners in Christendom. She was also, for nearly the entire time Anne served her, either pregnant or recovering from being pregnant. She would bear 7 children in 9 years and die, exhausted at 24, which meant her ladies effectively ran much of her daily life. Anne dressed her, attended her at Mass, read to her, and in the process absorbed French so thoroughly it became as natural to her as English. She adopted the French style of dress, including the elegant hood set back to reveal the hair, a look that would cause a minor sensation when she eventually brought it home. She learned to converse with a dry, playful wit that could hold a king's attention across a dinner table without ever crossing into impropriety. Anne's older sister, Mary, was at the French court as well for a time, and her experience there diverged sharply from Anne's. Where Anne learned to keep people at arm's length, Mary did not seem to hold much of anything at arm's length at all. She became, briefly, one of the many young women who caught the eye of Francis I, a king with a well-known appetite for such things and very little discretion about it. Whatever the true extent of the affair, Mary left France carrying a reputation that would follow her for years. Anne left France having watched, up close, exactly what happened to a woman who gave a king everything and kept nothing in reserve. Nobody needed to explain the lesson to her. She had watched her own sister demonstrate it in real time. The court of Francis I was also, in these years, a hotbed of new religious and intellectual currents. Francis himself was a lavish patron of the arts, and in his younger years, relatively open to the reform movements stirring across the continent. His sister, Marguerite of Navarre, was a serious, independent-minded woman who protected reformist thinkers and corresponded with theologians across Europe. She read scripture in French translation. She kept a personal library that traveled everywhere with her, not as decoration, but as a framework for thinking about monarchy, about the relationship between a ruler and God, and about what a church was actually supposed to be. In the summer of 1520, while Anne was still in France, 2 kings she would come to know intimately, Francis of France and Henry of England, met near Calais for 18 days of staggering, ruinously expensive display, an event history remembers as the Field of Cloth of Gold. Temporary palaces built of canvas and timber were painted to resemble stone. Fountains ran with wine instead of water. There were jousts, banquets, wrestling matches, and enough gold thread woven into fabric to have bankrupted a smaller kingdom. Anne, attached to the French queen's household, was almost certainly somewhere in that vast temporary city. Henry VIII was there too, 29 years old, athletic, golden-haired, at the very height of his physical magnificence, wrestling with Francis in front of the assembled nobility of 2 nations. It is one of history's strange, small ironies that the man and woman who would eventually tear England away from Rome may well have stood in the same French field a full decade before either of them had any reason to notice the other. She was a diplomat's daughter, attending a queen. He was a king. There was no reason in the world for him to look twice at her. By the time she turned 20, Anne Boleyn was unlike any Englishwoman of her generation. She carried herself with a confidence that could easily be read as arrogance. She could discuss poetry and politics in the same breath. She understood, from years spent watching Francis maneuver through his own court, that a king could be flattered, managed, even quietly steered, but never owned outright. And she had watched, through her own sister's experience, exactly what happened to a woman who made herself too easily available to a man who held all the power. In 1521, the political chessboard shifted once more. War between England and France was brewing, and Thomas Boleyn, now serving as English ambassador in Paris, decided it was time to bring his younger daughter home. Anne packed her French gowns, her books, her lute, and a decade of continental education, and boarded a ship for England. She had left as a promising child of 12. She returned as a young woman shaped by the two most sophisticated courts in Europe, fluent in French, quietly steeped in reformist religious thought, and armed with a set of social instincts nobody at the somewhat provincial English court had ever encountered before. She was about to walk into a room containing a bored, restless king who did not yet know he was looking for something. Someone. A debut at York Place. The ship carrying Anne Boleyn back to England docked at Dover on a gray winter afternoon in early 1522. The kind of afternoon where sea and sky seemed to blur into the same flat, indifferent color. She stepped onto the stone quay wrapped in French wool, her trunks heavy with gowns and books, her head still full of a decade's worth of continental music, conversation, and quiet theology. The air smelled of salt and wood smoke, and beneath that, something else, the particular staleness of a country that had not yet caught up to the places she had just come from. She was home. She was also, in every way that mattered, a different person than the girl who had left. She was perhaps 21 now, and she moved like someone who had been shaped by the two most refined courts in Europe and knew it. Every gesture, every inflection of her voice, every small tilt of her chin seemed to announce that she was no longer quite English and had no particular wish to become so again. Her father had not called her home out of sentiment. Thomas Boleyn was in the middle of negotiating a marriage that would tie the Boleyn family more tightly to the Irish earldom of Ormond, a title he had been pursuing for years through his own mother's line. The plan was simple on paper. Marry Anne to her Irish cousin, James Butler, settle a long-running inheritance dispute, and fold the Ormond lands neatly into the Boleyn family's growing portfolio. Anne was not consulted. Daughters of ambitious courtiers rarely were. But she understood the mechanics of the arrangement as well as her father did. She had spent 7 years watching the marriage market operate at the very top of European society, and she knew precisely what she was worth on that market. not love, but land, alliance, and advantage. Before any formal betrothal could proceed, however, Thomas wanted his daughter seen at court. He wanted the king and his counselors to register exactly what kind of asset he had brought home. And so, in March of 1522, Anne made her English debut in the most public way imaginable. She appeared at a lavish court entertainment held at York Place, dressed in white embroidered satin, taking part in an elaborate allegorical pageant called the Shadowfurt, the Green Castle. It was precisely the sort of spectacle Henry VII adored. Elaborate costumes, music, and a mock siege in which 8 ladies representing feminine virtues defended a castle against 8 lords representing masculine strength. The whole thing resolving in a shower of sweets thrown out across the hall. Anne played the role of perseverance. Her sister Mary played kindness, and Henry himself led the attacking lords, thinly disguised, as though anyone in that hall could possibly fail to recognize the largest, loudest, most magnificently dressed man in the room. Torchlight threw shifting shadows across the tapestries as Anne moved through the choreography with a natural grace that made the English ladies around her look stiff by comparison. She sang. She danced. She delivered her lines in an accent that was English by birth, but French by long habit. The court had never quite seen anything like her, and it was not immediately clear that they liked it. One Venetian ambassador, writing some years later, described Anne as not conventionally the most beautiful woman he had encountered, but noted she possessed something more dangerous than beauty presence. Her skin was dark by the standards of English fashion, closer to olive than the pale rose the court favored. Her hair was black, thick, and long. Her eyes were dark and unusually expressive, and she seemed to know exactly what to do with all of it. She dressed in the French style, with her hood set back to show her hairline, a silhouette that whispered of a wider, more sophisticated world. One the English court secretly envied and openly resented. She was appointed a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon, a perfectly respectable placement for the daughter of a rising diplomat. Catherine's household was a quiet, deeply devout place, organized around prayer, needlework, and charitable work. The Queen herself was a woman of formidable dignity, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, a survivor of widowhood and years of financial hardship in her early years in England. She had been married to Henry for well over a decade, and in that time had endured at least 6 pregnancies. Only one child had survived, a daughter, Mary. The rest ended in stillbirth, miscarriage, or infants who lived only days or weeks before dying. Catherine bore all of it with the rigid composure of a woman who believed, without question, that her suffering was part of a divine plan not meant to be argued with. Anne watched her closely. She watched how Catherine managed the king's moods, how she wielded quiet moral authority without ever raising her voice. Anne was absorbing lessons, though she could not yet have said what she was absorbing them for. Henry Percy, and the weight of Cardinal Wolsey. It was around 1523 that Anne fell into something that resembled genuine love. The young man was Henry Percy, heir to the earldom of Northumberland, gentle-mannered, with one of the largest inheritances in northern England waiting for him. Percy served in the household of Cardinal Wolsey, the king's powerful chief minister, and he and Anne kept finding reasons to be in the same rooms. They talked. They danced. They exchanged the kind of glances that, at a court where every single gesture was observed and catalogued, amounted to a public declaration. Eventually, without consulting anyone, they made a private promise to each other, a secret betrothal, which under church law, once properly witnessed and consummated, carried nearly the same binding weight as marriage itself. Whether the two of them ever consummated it, no one now living can say, but the commitment was serious enough that Percy began behaving as though Anne were already, in some sense, his wife. The news reached Cardinal Wolsey within days. Everything reached Wolsey within days, and his response was swift and merciless. Percy was already promised to another woman, Mary Talbot, daughter of the Earl of Shrewsbury, in a match Wolsey himself had arranged. The Cardinal had no intention of letting a great northern heir throw away a carefully built alliance for the sake of an ambitious knight's daughter from a family he privately regarded as upstarts. He summoned Percy, and in front of a room full of witnesses, tore into him, called him a foolish boy, told him the king had other plans in mind for Anne, though what those plans were, nobody at that point could have said, and ordered him to forget her entirely and marry the woman he had been assigned. Percy, terrified of the Cardinal in the way that everyone at court was terrified of the Cardinal, folded immediately. He went home, married Mary Talbot in what would become one of the coldest, most miserable unions in the English nobility, and never spoke to Anne again. Anne herself was sent away from court, back to Hever, in what amounted to an internal exile. She had been publicly humiliated, reminded in the cruelest possible terms that her own feelings counted for nothing in the machinery of aristocratic marriage. The weeks she spent walking the familiar paths around the moat, sitting in the rooms she had grown up in, amounted to a kind of dark education. No record survives of her weeping or raging, if she did either. What does survive is the cold, clear understanding that seems to have taken root in her during that exile. Emotion was a liability. Trust was a trap. The only person who was ever going to look out for Anne Boleyn was Anne Boleyn, and she did not forget Wolsey. The grudge settled into her like a stone and sat there, growing heavier year after year, until the day came when she could finally make use of it. The proposed marriage to James Butler, meanwhile, quietly collapsed under the weight of unresolved legal and financial complications, the way these arranged matches often did. Both sides eventually stopped pretending it would happen. Anne was free of the Irish entanglement, free of the expectation that she would vanish into the countryside as some cousin's wife. She returned to court, reinstated among Catherine's ladies, but she was not the same young woman who who had danced as Perseverance in the Green Castle. She was sharper now, wearier, far less inclined to charm people simply for the pleasure of it. She had learned to keep her real thoughts hidden behind a screen of wit, and she had learned that anyone who holds power will use you, unless you find a way to make yourself useful to them on your own terms first. The king begins to notice, sometime around 1525 or 1526, Henry VI began to notice her. It did not happen all at once. Henry, in his mid-30s, was still an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, athletic, golden-haired, carrying the effortless confidence of a man who had been told since the cradle that he was the most handsome prince in Christendom, and had never been given serious reason to doubt it. He hunted. He jousted. He composed music that was, by most accounts, genuinely quite good. He debated theology with his chaplains for entertainment, and he conducted his romantic affairs with the casual discretion of a man who did not believe ordinary rules were written with him in mind. For several years, his principal mistress had been a gentle, fair-haired woman named Elizabeth Blount, who had given him something Catherine never could, a healthy, living son. That boy, Henry Fitzroy, stood as living proof that the failure to produce a legitimate male heir was not, in Henry's mind, his own fault. Catherine, now past 40, was almost certainly not going to conceive again. Henry had made a kind of uneasy peace with the situation, or told himself he had. He had a daughter. He had an illegitimate son he was fond of, and had loaded with titles and lands. He had wars, treaties, and building projects to occupy his days. But underneath, all the activity ran a thin, constant thread of dread. A king without a legitimate son was a king whose entire life's work could unravel the moment he closed his eyes for good. His own grandfather had won the crown on a battlefield precisely because the previous century had run out of clear heirs. That was not distant history to Henry. That was the family business, and he knew it in his bones. When his attention first landed on Anne, it was probably nothing more complicated than simple attraction. She was different, unreadable, in a court where nearly everyone else was transparent to him. She spoke French with a genuine Parisian lilt. She could hold her own in a conversation about poetry, music, or scripture. She had opinions and was not afraid to voice them directly to his face, and she did not blush and stammer the way most young women did in his presence. She answered him with a dry, faintly challenging wit that nobody else at court would have dared use on the king. And crucially, she did not appear especially eager to win his favor. That, more than the dark eyes or the French gowns, is likely what pulled him in. Henry had spent his entire life being pursued. Here, at last, was someone who seemed to be walking in the other direction. By the spring of 1527, the King of England was writing her love letters. 17 of them survive today, housed through one of history's stranger twists in the Vatican Library, the very institution Henry would soon defy entirely. They are remarkable documents, intimate, pleading, at times almost boyishly desperate. He wrote to her in French their shared private language. He complained that he had been struck by the arrow of love for over a year, and still did not know whether he held any place in her heart. He begged her to write back, to give him some sign, to declare herself his alone, body and soul. Anne did write back. Her side of the correspondence has not survived. She was far too careful to have kept his letters lying around, and it seems she was equally careful about what she put in writing herself. But the shape of her responses can be reconstructed from his replies. She was warm, but guarded. She accepted his devotion without ever quite returning it on the terms he wanted. She drew a line, a firm and unmistakable one, and then held it for month after month, while the most powerful man in England battered himself against it. She would not become his mistress. This was not simple modesty, and it would be a mistake to read it that way. Anne had watched her own sister Mary become the king's mistress a few years earlier, by then Mary, home from France, and married off to a pleasant, unremarkable courtier named William Carey, had caught Henry's eye in her turn, and carried on a quiet affair with him for a year or two. Mary bore 2 children during that period, and there were whispers at court, never confirmed and never fully silenced, that one or both were the king's. Henry never acknowledged either child. That silence was the entire point, and Anne understood it completely. Her sister had given the king everything and asked for nothing, and had received exactly that in return nothing. She had been enjoyed, then quietly set aside, married off deeper into obscurity, and largely forgotten by everyone except the court gossips. Anne had also spent her most formative years at the French court, where royal mistresses could hold genuine, glittering power for a while, and then be replaced, pensioned off, or eased into a convent, with the glitter simply transferring to whoever came next. So Anne made a calculation that no woman in her position had quite dared to make before. She told Henry, in words paraphrased down through the centuries, but never confirmed by any surviving document, that she would rather lose her life than her honor. She would give him her heart, her loyalty, her company, her conversation, but not her body, not as a mistress, not unless and until she could give it to him as his lawful wife. On its face, the demand was absurd, and she knew it was absurd. A king of England did not marry a knight's daughter. He married a foreign princess whose bloodline and dowry secured alliances and territory, and the goodwill of other crowns. Catherine herself was the daughter of 2 reigning monarchs. Anne was the daughter of a diplomat and a Howard girl. By every rule anyone actually lived by, the gap between them was simply unbridgeable. And yet, by the time Anne made her position plain, something had already begun shifting in Henry's mind. Something that had very little to do with her personally, and everything to do with his own increasingly tormented conscience. The king's great matter begins. Henry had convinced himself that his marriage to Catherine was cursed. A particular verse from the book of Leviticus had lodged itself in his mind, and would not come loose. If a man takes his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing, and they will be childless. Catherine had, in fact, been married first, briefly, before Henry, to his older brother Arthur, Prince of Wales, who had died only months after their wedding, when both were barely more than children. Catherine had sworn then, and every year after, that the marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, that she had come to Henry's bed as a virgin. For years, Henry had believed her, or simply hadn't thought hard about it. But now, staring down the long line of dead infants, and the single surviving daughter, and the permanently empty royal cradle, he had stopped believing it. He looked at all that loss and saw, in it, the hand of an angry God punishing him for a marriage that had been sinful from its very foundation. Anne did not invent that conviction, but she gave it shape. She gave Henry a language and a direction to point his fear in. Sometime around 1528, she placed a particular book into his hands, a dangerous book to be caught holding. It was the Obedience of a Christian Man by the reformist theologian William Tyndale, whose English translation of the New Testament was officially banned in England, hunted down, and burned wherever royal authorities could find copies. Tyndale argued that kings derived their authority directly from God and from no one else, that the church within each realm should answer to its own anointed monarch, not to a bishop sitting in a distant Italian city, and that a king who knelt to a foreign pope was no true king at all. Anne had read it closely. She had marked certain passages. She handed it to Henry and told him, in effect, that it was a book every king ought to study. He read it, and the idea took root in soil that had already been carefully prepared for it. What followed would consume years, and it would swallow up men far more powerful than Anne Boleyn ever was. Contemporaries called it, with a kind of exhausted grandeur, the king's great matter. The initial strategy was narrow and legal. Henry would argue that the original papal dispensation permitting his marriage to his brother's widow had been invalid from the very beginning, because the biblical prohibition against such a marriage was absolute, beyond even the Pope's power to override. If the dispensation was worthless, the marriage itself was worthless. And the king had, in the eyes of God, always been a single man, Cardinal Wolsey, serving simultaneously as papal legate, and the king's chief minister was handed the impossible task of making that argument hold. It did not hold. Pope Clement VII was trapped in a vice of his own at that precise moment, effectively a prisoner of the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, who happened to be Catherine of Aragon's own nephew, and whose armies had sacked Rome itself only months earlier, leaving the Pope negotiating for his own survival. Granting Henry an annulment meant publicly humiliating the emperor by declaring his aunt a woman who had lived in sin for 2 decades. Refusing it meant enraging a king of England, who, for all his loud piety, was beginning to show a temper capable of redrawing the religious map of an entire continent. So Clement did what popes under pressure have always done. He stalled. He appointed commissions. He dispatched legates, who traveled slowly and deliberated even more slowly, gently suggesting that perhaps the whole unpleasant business could resolve itself if Henry simply accepted his marriage as valid and stopped asking questions about it. Henry did not stop asking, and Anne, through all of it, remained at his side. She began appearing with him at banquets and hunting parties, seated not discreetly in the shadows, but in the place of honor that belonged, by right, to the Queen. She received foreign ambassadors. She discussed policy. She offered opinions, and remarkably for a woman of her rank, those opinions were listened to. The French ambassador reported home more than once that Anne was functioning as queen in everything but name, that the king spent far more time in her company than in Catherine's, and that she had become the figure through whom favors, appointments, and access to the royal ear all now flowed. By the late 1520s, she was, in her own right, a genuine political figure, and she used that position deliberately in service of the cause she cared about most. She championed a quiet Cambridge scholar named Thomas Cranmer, who had made the shrewd suggestion that Henry stop waiting on Rome entirely, and instead put the theological question directly to the great universities of Europe. She supported the smuggling and distribution of English-language Bibles. She began, patiently, to build a network of allies who shared her particular vision of a church answerable to the English crown rather than to the See of Rome. And through all of it, she held the line. She was still not his mistress. What had begun as a king's idle pursuit had by now become the defining obsession of his life. He had staked his authority, his dynasty, and in his own mind, his very soul on this one woman. And she remained, technically, still out of his reach. That unreachability was her power, and all three of them, Henry, Anne, and the entire watching court, understood it perfectly. The first great casualty of the stalemate was Cardinal Wolsey himself. By 1529, after years of fruitless negotiation, he had failed to deliver the one thing the king wanted above everything else. A special court convened at Blackfriars in London, with Wolsey and a visiting Roman cardinal sitting in judgment. And it collapsed in an extraordinary piece of public theater when Catherine, refusing to accept the court's authority over her, crossed the floor of the hall, knelt before Henry in front of the entire assembly, and swore on her immortal soul that she had come to him a true virgin. Then she rose, walked out, and would not return, no matter how many times her name was called. The case was referred back to Rome, where everyone understood it would now die a slow, deliberate death. Wolsey was finished. Anne's hand was in what followed, though she was careful to keep it well out of sight. She had never forgiven the cardinal for engineering the destruction of her engagement to Henry Percy, and she watched, with a satisfaction she did not particularly bother to hide from those close to her, as the king stripped Wolsey of his offices, his staggering wealth, and his magnificent palace at Hampton Court, which Henry simply claimed for himself. Wolsey was arrested on a charge of treason in the autumn of 1530 and died on the road south at Leicester Abbey, an old and broken man, before he could ever be brought to trial. A convenient death, some whispered. A mercy, said others. Anne said nothing at all in public, but she did not mourn him. The path to the throne was clearing. But it was still blocked by two immovable obstacles: the distant, stubborn authority of Rome, and the woman herself, still Queen Catherine in the eyes of the Church and much of the country. The Pope would not yield. Catherine would not yield. And Anne, now moving through her late 20s, was running short of the one resource a woman in her exact position could least afford to lose: time. The years of waiting, the months following Wolsey's death, settled into something strange and suspended, like a breath held too long. Anne had won a real victory. The man who had humiliated her over Henry Percy was dead, his fortunes swallowed whole by the crown, his palaces stripped bare and redistributed. But the larger prize, the marriage itself, the crown itself, still hung frustratingly out of reach. The Pope would not move. Catherine would not retreat quietly into a convent, which would have solved everything neatly, and which she rejected with total contempt every single time it was suggested to her. And Anne watched the years slide past without a ring on her finger or a child in her arms. She did not spend the waiting idly. She spent it building. By this point, she had become, quite possibly, the single most effective distributor of banned evangelical literature in all of England. Forbidden texts, English scripture, reformist pamphlets, the sort of material that could get a printer burned at the stake, found their way into her hands through sympathetic merchants and clergy, smuggled in hidden among bales of cloth and barrels of Rhenish wine, arriving off ships from Antwerp. From her hands, these texts traveled outward again, to courtiers she thought might be persuaded, to scholars, to bishops she judged useful in shifting the theological ground beneath the English Church. She was not merely a patroness who enjoyed the idea of reform from a comfortable distance. She was an active, working node in a genuine underground network, one that ran from the printing presses of the Low Countries all the way to the candlelit studies of Cambridge dons. And she took real, tangible personal risk to keep that network functioning. Thomas Cranmer, she drew closer still. He had already impressed the king with his suggestion about canvassing the great universities of Europe for their opinion on the marriage question, and Anne recognized the brilliance of it immediately. A way to build an overwhelming weight of scholarly opinion in Henry's favor without ever once having to ask Rome's permission. She made certain Henry kept listening to him. Cranmer was dispatched to the continent with a formal commission to survey the theology faculties of Paris, Orleans, Bologna, and Ferrara, returning with their verdicts on the question consuming England. Opinion after opinion came back favorable to the king's position. Several of them, it must be said, quietly encouraged along by English money changing hands in exactly the right rooms. Cranmer came home no longer a humble Cambridge don, but a man plainly marked out for the very highest office the English Church had to offer. Anne's own family rose alongside her. Her father was elevated to Earl of Wiltshire. Her brother George became Viscount Rochford. An entire family was ascending together, riding entirely on the strength of one woman's hold over the king's affections. The old nobility, the Howards, the Staffords, the rest of the established aristocratic families, watched the Boleyns' rapid climb with a mixture of envy and genuine alarm. A knight's granddaughter was outmaneuvering the lot of them, and everyone knew it, and nobody forgave her for it. Even her wardrobe became a kind of political argument. French velvet gowns, jewels that outshone the Queen's own, worn deliberately in Catherine's presence. Her hood, that distinctive French crescent, set back off the forehead, stood in pointed contrast to the heavier, old-fashioned English gable hood that Catherine and her loyal ladies still wore. It was as though Anne dressed every single day for a role she had not yet officially been given, quietly daring anyone in the room to suggest she stop. Her relationship with Catherine, meanwhile, had curdled into something openly poisonous. The two women existed in the same court, sometimes under the very same roof, and the tension in any room containing both of them was almost unbearable. Catherine, with her unbending dignity, refused to treat Anne as anything but a lady-in-waiting who had shamefully forgotten her proper place. Anne, for her part, could be genuinely cruel in return. She was once overheard, in a moment of frustration that spread through the court, and did her lasting damage, wishing that every Spaniard alive were at the bottom of the sea. It was the kind of remark a woman could only make if she felt absolutely certain of the king's protection. Anne was, at that point, entirely certain. It did not, however, win her a single friend. Cromwell and a new kind of danger, beneath the surface of the great matter. A new and far more consequential rivalry was quietly taking shape. One that would, in the end, prove considerably more dangerous to Anne than her feud with a discarded queen ever could. Thomas Cromwell had risen out of the wreckage of Wolsey's fall. He was, in a world that deeply distrusted self-made men, entirely self-made, the son of a Putney blacksmith and brewer, who had knocked around Europe as a soldier and a merchant before teaching himself law, and clawing his way methodically into royal service. He was brilliant, tireless, precise, and entirely without illusions about how power actually worked. In the earlier years of the great matter, Cromwell and Anne had functioned as genuine allies. They wanted the same immediate outcome, the break from Rome, the creation of a sovereign English church answerable to no outside authority, and they worked together toward it. But their visions diverged sharply on one enormous question: money. Cromwell was already, in his methodical way, preparing for what would become the dissolution of the monasteries. The largest single transfer of wealth England would see between the Norman conquest and the modern era. He looked at the vast lands and treasuries held by the religious houses and saw a war chest, a fortune capable of refilling the king's chronically empty treasury, funding a navy, and buying the loyalty of the nobility for a generation to come. Anne looked at the very same wealth and saw something entirely different. She agreed the monasteries were often corrupt and badly in need of reform. But she believed their riches ought to be redirected toward education, toward relief for the poor, toward new bishoprics and scholarships, toward building a genuinely reformed church that actually served the people it drew from. She called Cromwell more than once, and not always in private, a man of low birth who did not understand the obligations of Christian charity. He, in the privacy of his own rooms, called her a dangerous meddler who would wreck the entire design if somebody didn't stop her. They were each, as it turned out, quite right about the other, and they both knew it. Calais and the turning point. In the autumn of 1532, after years of grinding stalemate, everything suddenly accelerated. Henry decided to bring Anne across the Channel to Calais, England's last remaining foothold on the French coast, for a face-to-face summit with King Francis I on the surface. This was diplomacy. Henry needed French support, or at minimum French neutrality, in his standoff against the Pope and the Emperor. But it was also, unmistakably, a debut. Anne traveled as though she were already queen. She was lodged in the finest apartments available. She dined with Francis. She danced at his entertainments and received his gifts. The French king, who had known her years earlier only as a minor attendant in his own wife's household, now treated her as a royal consort in her own right. For Anne, the trip must have felt like both a homecoming and a vindication, braided together into a single, unforgettable fortnight. Something else happened at Calais, something private, and enormous in its consequences. For roughly 6 years, Anne and Henry had maintained their strange, chaste, maddening arrangement, an almost unbelievable feat of restraint on both sides. But at Calais, with the French court treating her openly as a queen, and the annulment still frozen somewhere in Rome, the calculation finally shifted. They slept together, and Anne became pregnant almost immediately, a fact that would announce itself within a few weeks of their return to England. The barrier she had held for 6 long years, through every temptation and every royal outburst, came down at last, far from the disapproving eyes of home. The pregnancy changed everything, because it placed a hard, unarguable deadline on a situation that had drifted for years. 6 years of waiting, negotiation, and theological argument suddenly had a clock ticking on top of it. Whatever child was growing inside her had to be born legitimate, had to be born a recognized prince or princess of England, not a bastard whose claim to anything could someday be challenged. Henry, sensing the stakes, began moving now with the speed of a man who had unexpectedly been handed a second chance at everything he wanted at once. A secret wedding on the 25th of January, 1533, in the early hours of the morning, in a private chamber deep within one of the royal palaces. Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn were quietly married. The ceremony was secret, witnessed by only a small handful of people sworn to absolute silence. Anne was already pregnant, perhaps by a few weeks. The small, secret swell of her belly was the entire reason for the haste, and for now, it remained their secret alone. For the next several months, that secret held. In May of 1533, Cranmer, freshly installed as Archbishop of Canterbury, convened his own church court at Dunstable Priory. Catherine was formally summoned to appear. As everyone expected, she refused, insisting to the very end that she remained the one true queen, and that no court within England held any authority over her marriage whatsoever. Cranmer proceeded without her, and issued the ruling Henry had been chasing for 7 exhausting years. The marriage to Catherine of Aragon was declared null and void, invalid from the very day it had been made. Anne's marriage to Henry was, therefore, entirely lawful. She was queen. The announcement sent shockwaves through England and across Europe. The Pope threatened excommunication. The Emperor raged. But Henry, for the first time in years, no longer cared what either of them thought, because he finally had what he wanted, and he ordered a coronation on a scale the country had genuinely never seen before. No expense was spared. Cloth of gold, triumphal arches built specifically for the occasion, an entire fleet of decorated barges. The date was set for the 1st of June, when Anne would be crowned at Westminster Abbey, visibly pregnant with the heir everyone simply assumed would be a boy. 4 days of pageantry. The festivities stretched across 4 days, and they were designed as one long, continuous argument, spelled out in gold and pageantry, insisting that this marriage was legitimate, and this new queen was to be loved. On the 29th of May, the city's great trade companies brought Anne up the Thames from Greenwich in a procession of decorated barges, bells ringing across the water, guns firing salutes from the ships lining the banks. One barge carried an enormous mechanical dragon that belched fire and smoke into the river air, while costumed men capered around it, throwing sparks and flame for the crowds. At the very front of the procession went a barge bearing Anne's own personal emblem, displayed publicly for the first time in its full splendor. A white-crowned falcon standing atop a golden tree stump, from which fresh red and white roses burst upward, the dead Tudor stump bursting back into bloom because of her. It was a clever, pointed piece of symbolism. The white falcon had been a badge of her Butler and Ormond ancestors, quietly asserting her ancient lineage, and the roses springing from the old dead stump promised precisely what Anne had come there to deliver: new life for the dynasty, an heir, a future. Her personal motto was displayed beside it, deliberately written in plain English rather than courtly French: the most happy. That was the badge. That was the claim. The following day, she moved through the city itself, from the Tower to Westminster, along streets that had been swept clean and hung with tapestry, past fountains running with wine, past elaborate staged pageants at every major crossing. At Cornhill, she was greeted by a tableau of the Three Graces. At the little conduit in Cheapside, a mechanical white falcon descended and was crowned by an angel, while verses were recited comparing Anne to the mother of the coming Tudor son. Enormous care and enormous sums of money had gone into every single one of these displays. Humanist scholars had written the verses, and yet the chroniclers present noted, with a certain visible discomfort, that the elaborate pageants were received by the watching crowds in a heavy, resentful silence. The people of London had loved Catherine of Aragon for more than 2 decades. They saw her as a wronged, pious woman cast aside in her middle age for a dark-eyed woman half her years. No amount of fire-breathing river dragons was going to change their minds about that. The wine ran. The falcon was duly crowned. And the crowds, for the most part, kept their caps firmly on their heads and their blessings firmly in their mouths. Coronation morning. On the morning of the 1st of June, London woke to the sound of church bells and the clatter of hooves. And here we return to the very scene where our story began. The thin gray light, the swept streets, the half-mile procession winding out from the Tower of London. Now we can step inside it properly. Anne rode in a litter of white satin, draped in silver cloth that shimmered faintly, even beneath that muted sky. Her gown was purple velvet over a silver tissue underskirt, her dark hair loose over her shoulders, the traditional mark of a bride approaching a sacred duty. An ermine cloak covered her shoulders. Above her, a canopy of cloth of gold was carried by 4 men walking with the slow, deliberate gait of people who understood that a single stumble would be remembered for generations. Around her rode the full apparatus of the realm, foreign merchants, gentlemen, the newly created Knights of the Bath in their fresh ceremonial robes, bishops, the great officers of state carrying the ceremonial swords and scepters of England. And the crowds pressed against the barriers, thousands of faces turned toward her, entirely silent, not the hush of awe, but something colder and harder than that. Here and there, a lone voice called out a blessing, but it died quickly in the general quiet. Somewhere in the press of bodies, a knot of men caught sight of that entwined H and stitched into the banners overhead and began laughing, turning the 2 letters into a crude joke that rippled outward through the crowd. Anne could hear it. She kept her chin lifted and her eyes fixed on the middle distance, and she did not flinch, because whatever else this morning was, it was the thing she had spent 7 years and every ounce of her considerable nerve fighting to reach. Inside Westminster Abbey, the world changed again. The silence there was a different kind of silence, thick with incense, ancient, holy. Anne processed the long nave with her train carried behind her, knelt on the cold stone before the high altar, and allowed Thomas Cranmer to anoint her with holy oil, and set upon her head the heavy crown of Saint Edward, the Confessor, followed by a second, lighter crown made especially for her. The choir sang the great hymn of praise, and for one long moment she simply knelt there beneath the weight of the gold. A knight's daughter from a moated house in Kent, now the anointed Queen of England, in the very same abbey where every English queen before her had been crowned since the Norman conquest. She had done it, every bit of it. Henry watched the entire ceremony from a curtained gallery high above the floor, hidden from view, a king who had broken with 1,000 years of Roman authority for this one woman, and who was certain, absolutely certain, that she was carrying his son. A queen settles. After the coronation, Anne settled into the rhythms of queenship at Greenwich. Her household was established on a grand scale, filled with ladies, gentlemen, chaplains, and musicians. She hung her private apartments with rich tapestries and filled them with the books she had been collecting since her girlhood years in France: French Bibles, evangelical tracts, works of humanist scholarship, several of them still technically illegal to own. Without much competition, she was one of the most intellectually engaged consorts England had ever had, and she made sure her court reflected exactly that. The pregnancy advanced through the summer. Astrologers and physicians lined up to assure the king, with total and unwavering confidence, that the child would be a prince. Henry ordered a magnificent tournament to be held the very moment the boy was born. A gilded cradle stood ready and waiting in the nursery. Letters announcing the birth to the courts of Europe were drafted in advance, with the word prince already inked into the sentence, needing only a date. There was no second version prepared. Nobody imagined a second version would ever be necessary. On the 7th of September, 1533, in a chamber at Greenwich hung with tapestries depicting the life of a saint, Anne went into labor. The birth itself was straightforward, and the child was healthy and strong. And when the cry rang out across the palace, the word that followed it was not the word all of England had spent 9 months preparing to hear. Picture it for a moment, as she must have lived it. You are lying in a great curtained bed, exhausted and triumphant, having just done the one thing you were brought to this palace to do. You have carried a child to term and delivered it alive, which is more than the woman you replaced managed in 20 years of trying. You are waiting to hear the single word that will finally make you untouchable. And the word, when it comes, is the wrong one. It is a girl, a perfect, red-haired, furious girl, a daughter, not a son. Anne named the girl Elizabeth, after Henry's own mother, Elizabeth of York, a name loaded with meaning, one that quietly announced this child belonged at the very center of the Tudor project, whatever her sex. But Henry, standing in the doorway, or packing somewhere in the room beyond, could not entirely keep the disappointment off his face. He had gambled a kingdom, and by his own reckoning, his soul, on the certainty that God would reward him with a son. God had given him a daughter instead. He did not rage. He did not weep. He simply set his jaw, quietly canceled the great tournament that had already been planned down to the smallest detail, and watched as clerks hastily corrected the pre-written letters. The word prince scratched out, princess squeezed awkwardly above it in a different hand. Anne took a different lesson from that cradle than Henry did. She looked at the small, furious, red-haired girl in her arms and saw not a failure, but an inheritance worth defending. To the open scandal of the court, she insisted on nursing Elizabeth herself for as long as she was permitted. Queens did not do that. That was precisely what wet nurses existed for. And she fought Henry over every detail of the child's household, demanding more staff, better rooms, more frequent visits. When Elizabeth was eventually established at Hatfield, the traditional royal nursery palace, Anne traveled there whenever she could, bringing caps and gowns she had chosen or embroidered herself, spending hours in the nursery with a devotion that surprised even the people who knew her best. Whatever else was said about Anne Boleyn, and a great deal of it was unkind, this much was true. She was determined that this particular daughter would grow up absolutely certain that she was wanted, but the pressure was already gathering behind her again. The country had celebrated a coronation and a christening. What Henry needed now, with something close to physical hunger, was a son. The silence of the crowds on that June morning had been a warning. The quietly cancelled tournament was another. A queen who could not deliver a boy was, whether anyone said it aloud, yet or not, a queen living on borrowed time, supreme head on earth. In the autumn of 1534, Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, and with it, quietly, on a single page of dry legal English, the entire country changed its foundations. The wording was blunt. The king was declared the only supreme head on earth of the Church of England. Every subject of the realm, from the greatest duke down to the poorest tenant farmer, could now be required to swear an oath acknowledging this new arrangement. To refuse the oath was treason. Treason meant death. What had started as one man's argument about one marriage had hardened into the settled law of the land. And there was no longer any road back to Rome that did not run straight through a great deal of blood. Anne did not experience this moment as a spectator. She had helped build the intellectual scaffolding that made it possible, the smuggled books, the promoted scholars, the patient, careful argument that a king answered to God alone. And now that the principle had become law, she moved to press her advantage in the one arena where a queen could genuinely reshape a church: the appointment of its bishops. Whenever a see fell vacant, Anne's voice was in the king's ear, and the men she pushed forward were, almost without exception, reformers. There's a bishop worth pausing on here, a man named Hugh Latimer, because he illustrates exactly the kind of clergyman Anne wanted standing in an English pulpit. Latimer was a plain-spoken, fearless preacher from the Midlands who thundered openly against purgatory, the cult of saints, and the sale of holy relics. Precisely the sort of man a cautious court would ordinarily have kept at arm's length. Anne did not keep him at arm's length. She brought him in to preach before her directly. She protected him when conservative churchmen came after him on charges of heresy. And when the Diocese of Worcester fell open, she made certain Latimer got it, handing a fiery evangelical preacher an entire cathedral and a vast stretch of English countryside to preach across. She did this more than once, for more than one man. She was not simply approving names off a list handed to her. She was actively choosing the people who would shape what ordinary English men and women heard from the pulpit on a Sunday morning. And she was choosing them with clear intent. At the same time, she made herself the single most important patron the English Bible had. Printed scripture in English, still officially banned, still arriving hidden in the holds of merchant ships, came into her hands and radiated back out again from there. She kept a great English Bible open on a stand in her own private chambers, available to any of her ladies or any curious visitor who wanted to read it. And the message of that open book sitting in that particular room was unmistakable. The Word of God belonged to whoever could read it, not only to priests. And the Queen of England intended to personally guarantee that it stayed within reach. Her charitable giving during these years was extraordinary, even by the standards of a role that demanded public generosity as a matter of course. The clerks responsible for her accounts were reportedly startled by the sheer volume of it. Food and clothing distributed daily to the poor gathered at the palace gates. Funding for students at Cambridge, personal intercession with the king on behalf of prisoners, debtors, and widows. Some of this was undeniably theater. A queen was expected to play the role of merciful intercessor, and Anne knew her lines well. But the daily, relentless consistency of it suggests something underneath the performance too. A woman who had been branded a homewrecker and a usurper in the streets, determined, it seems, to be remembered instead as a giver. Perhaps she had even half convinced herself that enough generosity might eventually make her safe. 2 deaths that would not be forgotten. Not everyone experienced her reforming zeal as generosity. In 1535, the machinery of the oath ground its way into the lives of 2 of the most respected men in England. And Anne, fairly or not, was widely seen as one of the hands operating the lever. Sir Thomas More, the former Lord Chancellor and a scholar admired across the whole of Europe, and John Fisher, the elderly Bishop of Rochester, both refused to swear that Henry was supreme head of the church, and both refused to accept that the king's marriage to Anne was lawful. Fisher had been Catherine's most devoted defender for years. More simply, would not put his soul on the line for an oath he did not personally believe. Both men were imprisoned in the Tower, and in the summer of 1535, within a fortnight of each other, both were beheaded on Tower Hill for their refusal. All of Europe recoiled. These were not obscure heretics executed in some backwater. These were famous, learned, deeply pious men, and Henry had killed them for declining to publicly endorse his second marriage. Anne did not order their deaths. That responsibility belonged to Henry, and increasingly to Cromwell. But she was, in a very real sense, the reason the oath existed to be refused in the first place, and she made no particular secret of her contempt for men who defied it. The deaths deaths of Thomas More and John Fisher did nothing to soften the popular image of Anne Boleyn as a sympathetic figure. If anything, they confirmed the image the crowds already carried in their heads of a woman for whose sake good men were being sent to the block. There was also the strange affair of the woman they called the Nun of Kent. Elizabeth Barton was a young servant girl who fell into religious trances and delivered prophecies, building up over several years a considerable popular following that included monks, gentlemen, and at one point, even Cardinal Wolsey himself. So long as her visions concerned the general state of men's souls, she was tolerated, even celebrated. But as the great matter dragged on, her prophecies grew pointedly specific. She declared, in one of her trances, that if Henry set Catherine aside and married Anne, he would cease to be king within months and would die a villain's death. That was a dangerous thing to be shouting to large crowds while the king was, at that very moment, doing exactly what she was condemning. Barton and a circle of her supporters were arrested, forced to confess the visions had been fabricated, and in the spring of 1534, dragged to Tyburn and hanged. A prophet who had told the country Anne Boleyn's marriage would destroy the king was executed for saying so. History has a grim sense of timing. It would be another 2 years before anyone appreciated quite how sharp a joke that was. A badge that began to look like a reproach. That white-crowned falcon on its blooming stump was, by this point, carved and painted and stitched throughout the royal palaces, appearing everywhere Anne's presence needed to be marked. There's a small, telling anecdote from the period. A courtier out hunting is supposed to have seen the Queen's badge, the crowned falcon in all its finery, set up directly beside the old badge of Catherine of Aragon, a pomegranate, and to have watched, or claimed to have watched, members of the Queen's household deface the pomegranate. Whether that particular incident happened exactly as told hardly matters now. The two badges together summarized the entire quarrel in miniature. The pomegranate, ancient, Spanish, looking increasingly barren. The falcon, new, English, crowned, springing from a stump that was supposed to be bursting into fresh roses. Anne had chosen a badge that promised an heir, and hung it in every hall in the kingdom. And the longer she failed to deliver that heir, the more the badge began to look less like a promise, and more like a reproach she had nailed to her own walls with her own hands. Wolfhall, in the summer of 1535, Henry and Anne set out on a long royal progress through the west of England, moving from great house to great house in the way Tudor courts traditionally did, partly for pleasure, partly to be seen by the country at large, partly to eat their various hosts nearly into ruin. It was, by most accounts, a good stretch for the marriage. In early September, the royal party arrived for a few late summer days at a modest manor house in Wiltshire called Wolfhall, the family seat of Sir John Seymour, whose son already served at court, and whose pale, quiet, unremarkable daughter Jane was one of the Queen's own ladies-in-waiting. Nobody nobody bothered to write down anything dramatic about those particular days, because there was no reason to. Henry hunted in the Seymours' park. He was entertained under the Seymours' roof. The royal party moved on, but the king had now slept beneath the roof of the family, whose daughter would, before long, replace Anne and help, indirectly, to bring about her death. Anne was present for all of it, and by every surviving account, noticed nothing worth remembering. That is, more often than not, exactly how these things work. The trap closes so gradually, and from such an ordinary direction, that the person standing inside it feels nothing but the pleasant weather of an unremarkable September, the first miscarriage, because underneath all the patronage and pageantry, the one thing that could truly secure her position had still not arrived. Sometime in the summer of 1534, Anne had conceived again, and the entire court had held its breath. Then, in the late summer or early autumn, the pregnancy ended, a miscarriage, or perhaps a stillbirth. The surviving records are deliberately vague, because nobody particularly wished to commit a failure of this kind to permanent ink. Anne withdrew into her chambers. Henry went hunting. The silence between them afterward sat heavier than any argument could have. When they finally came back together, something in him had shifted. Henry began noticing other women again, not with the grand, obsessive, world-altering intensity with which he had once noticed Anne, but in the casual, hungry manner of a king who had always taken exactly what he pleased, and was beginning to feel he had paid a very great deal for this particular wife without getting his money's worth in return. Rumors began circulating about a young woman at court who had caught his eye. The rumors reached Anne, and they lit something in her that she could not put out. She raged. She wept. She confronted him directly, in front of his own counselors, her voice sharp and shaking, accusations spilling out faster than she could weigh a single one of them. And Henry, who had once found her fire the single most exciting thing in England, now found it merely exhausting. He told her coldly that she should learn to shut her eyes and endure, exactly as her betters had done before her, meaning Catherine, who had quietly endured his mistresses for 2 decades without a single public word of complaint. And he reminded her, in a sentence that must have gone through her like cold water, that he could lower her exactly as easily and exactly as quickly as he had raised her up in the first place. These scenes became a recurring feature of the marriage. Courtiers learned to step back the moment king and queen began hissing at each other across a room. Some were embarrassed by the spectacle. Some, quietly, were delighted by it. The conservative faction, men who had never accepted Anne or the break with Rome and had simply been waiting, began, for the first time, to smell blood in the water. Anne's temper, which had once been a genuine asset in a woman forced to fight for every inch of her position, had become, now that she was supposed at last to be secure, a plain and visible liability. The ordinary people of England had never warmed to her, and now their dislike hardened into something uglier and stranger still. When she appeared in public, the crowds thinned and turned sullen. reports followed her that were clearly meant to be overheard, and the rumors themselves turned frankly monstrous. It was whispered that she carried a sixth finger on one hand, the devil's mark, a sign of witchcraft. It was whispered that she hid a disfiguring growth on her throat beneath her high collars and her famous French hood. None of it was true. That same Venetian ambassador who owed her no particular flattery had described, on the record, a graceful neck and elegant hands. But truth was never really what these rumors were for. In the popular imagination, Anne had become something less than a bad queen, and something closer to a witch, a dark, foreign creature who had bewitched a good king and stolen a throne from a woman the country still regarded as a saint. And that saintly woman was still, at this point, very much alive, living in cold exile, which meant Anne was never truly, fully safe. A rival watched from a distance. Thomas Cromwell, now the king's indispensable chief minister, had by this stage moved decisively past the alliance he and Anne had once shared. The dissolution of the monasteries was beginning in earnest, and the great river of monastic wealth was starting to flow steadily toward the crown, toward the royal treasury, toward loyal men who could be secured with a grant of former abbey lands, exactly as Cromwell had always intended, and exactly as Anne had always opposed. She had not stopped opposing it. She arranged for one of her own chaplains to preach a sermon in front of the king and the assembled court, built around a biblical text concerning a wicked royal counselor who enriched himself while misleading his master. Nobody sitting in that chapel had the slightest doubt about whom the sermon was aimed at. It was a public shot fired directly across Cromwell's bow, delivered by a queen who still believed, correctly or not, that she retained the standing to fire it. Cromwell sat through the whole thing without visible reaction. Cromwell was, if nothing else, extremely good at sitting through things. But it was around this time that he began seriously considering the possibility that his own position, perhaps his own life, might not remain safe for as long as Anne Boleyn kept the king's ear. And he began, quietly and methodically, to think through what might eventually need to be done about that. A fragile hope. In the last months of 1535, a fragile new hope arrived. Anne was pregnant again. The familiar machinery started up once more, the prayers, the confidently reassuring astrologers, the careful preparations nobody dared name out loud for fear of tempting fate. Her women told her, with the flat certainty of people who cannot afford to consider any alternative, that this time it would be a boy. Then, on the 7th of January, 1536, a rider arrived at Greenwich carrying news that reordered everything overnight. Catherine of Aragon was dead. She had died at Kimbolton Castle in a cold bed, attended only by a handful of faithful servants, having dictated one final letter to Henry in which she addressed him as her most dear lord and husband, and begged him, at the very end, to be a good father to their daughter Mary. She had refused, right up to her last breath, to surrender the title of queen. Henry received the news with with an eruption of undisguised relief. He is reported to have cried out that England was now finally free of all threat of war with the Emperor. He ordered celebrations. He dressed himself and Anne head to foot in bright, defiant yellow, and paraded the young Elizabeth through the court in his own arms for everyone to admire. Anne, at his side in her own yellow gown, played the part of the triumphant queen to the very hilt, but something cold and frightened was moving underneath the performance, because Anne was clever enough to grasp immediately what Catherine's death had actually changed. As long as Catherine had lived, Henry could not easily rid himself of Anne without also facing the far greater horror of taking Catherine back, a woman he had come to loathe, and whose nephew commanded real armies across Europe. In a strange, backward way, that threat had made Anne genuinely protected, and now that protection had been lowered into a coffin and carried off toward a grave at Peterborough. For the very first time since his teenage years, Henry was a widower, with no complicating first wife waiting in the wings. In the cold arithmetic of royal marriage, he was, quite suddenly, free, and Anne was carrying the child she believed would finally save her. The second loss, the pregnancy, was well advanced by now, past the most dangerous early months. Anne withdrew from public view, resting, conserving her strength, willing her own body toward the single outcome that mattered more than anything else she had ever built in her life. Toward the end of January, the pains began far too early. She was rushed to her chamber. Midwives were summoned. The court fell into an anxious, waiting silence, and then, in a rush of blood, it was over. She had miscarried. The child was far enough along that its sex could be determined, and the word that traveled from the midwives to the counselors to the king himself was the cruelest one imaginable. It had been a boy. A son, roughly 15 or 16 weeks along, fully formed, already lost. And she had miscarried him on the very same day that Catherine of Aragon was being lowered into the ground at Peterborough Abbey. Henry came to her bedside that day. The room was dim and close, thick with the smell of blood and the bitter herbs the physicians had been burning. Anne lay pale against the pillows. What exactly passed between them survives only through the recollections of attendants standing too far off to catch every word, but the general shape of it has come down to us, and it is genuinely chilling. Henry told her he now understood that God would not grant him sons through her. He reminded her, as though she needed reminding, that he had lifted her up out of nothing. He spoke of his troubled conscience. He addressed his grieving wife not as a husband comforting her, but as a king reviewing the failure of a policy. And then he turned and left the room. Anne is said to have called after him from the bed that the loss was his own fault, that grief over his open pursuit of other women was what had shaken the child loose inside her. Perhaps she really did say it. It would have been true, and it would also have been precisely the wrong thing to say out loud. Saying the true and dangerous thing anyway had always been the most perilous habit Anne Boleyn ever carried with her. January miscarriage was the hinge on which her entire life turned. Before it, Anne was a queen in difficulty, struggling, quarreling, making enemies, but still the anointed wife, still under the king's formal protection, still the mother of a recognized legitimate heir. After it, she became something else entirely. She was a failed investment. She was a woman standing between Henry and a future he had already begun picturing in the privacy of his own mind, without her in it. A quiet, watchful girl. That future already had a name, and the name was Jane Seymour. She had been at court for some time by now. A quiet, unremarkable presence among Anne's own attendant ladies. The same pale, soft-spoken girl whose family's modest manor the royal court had visited the previous September. Fair-haired, gentle-mannered, Jane was, point for point, almost everything Anne Boleyn was not. Submissive, where Anne was sharp. Conventional, where Anne was foreign and striking. Silent, where Anne could never quite manage to hold her tongue. She came from perfectly respectable Wiltshire gentry stock, and she had absorbed early, perhaps more thoroughly than any other woman at court, the one lesson Anne herself had never fully learned, that a woman moving in the orbit of Henry VI survived longest by making herself small, agreeable, and entirely unthreatening. She rarely raised her voice. She offered no opinions of her own. She lowered her eyes and blushed precisely on cue. Henry's pursuit of her through the early months of 1536 was not subtle in the slightest, and it was, if anything, cruelly designed to be seen by everyone at court, Anne included. He sent Jane gifts. He seated her near him at every opportunity. There is a story, and it carries the ring of truth, that he once sent her a purse of gold coins along with a letter, and that Jane, carefully coached by her ambitious brothers, and by the conservative faction now quietly gathering behind her, kissed the letter, returned the purse entirely unopened, and sent word that she was a gentlewoman of good family who possessed nothing in the world but her honor, and that if the king truly wished to give her money, he might do so only once God had sent her a proper marriage. It was, of course, exactly the same maneuver Anne herself had made a decade earlier. Henry, a man who had already fallen hopelessly for one woman precisely, because she refused to simply lie down for him, fell for the identical performance a second time, apparently without ever once recognizing that he was watching a repeat, and saw all of it happening in real time. She confronted Henry directly. She confronted Jane directly. She wept, she raged, she made scenes in front of the entire court, and every single scene pushed Henry further away, sharpening the contrast between the two women with each passing week. Anne, with her fierce intelligence and her visible, unconcealed fear. Jane, with her downcast eyes and her perfectly patient stillness, and tried, through that spring, to fight back the only way she knew how. She dressed with extra care. She staged elaborate entertainments. She brought young Elizabeth to court and set the child directly in front of Henry, hoping the sight of their bright, red-haired daughter might reach something in him that words could no longer touch. He was polite. he was distant, somewhere behind those small, cold eyes. He had already made his decision. And Henry VII, once he had truly decided something, was a man capable of very nearly anything at all. The machine begins to turn. Thomas Cromwell, watching all of this unfold from his own offices, arrived at exactly the same conclusion the king had already reached, and he began quietly assembling a solution to the king's problem. One that would, conveniently, also solve his own. Anne was finished. The only remaining question was how to remove her cleanly without leaving behind a political mess. A second annulment would be humiliating for Henry and would raise uncomfortable questions about the legitimacy of the first one. Sending her to a convent would leave behind a dangerous, articulate, well-connected loose end, still alive and still capable of talking. The cleanest available solution, the one that had never yet been used against an anointed Queen of England, was death. But it would need to be legal, or at least legal enough to hold up convincingly in front of 2,000 watching spectators and a dozen foreign ambassadors sending reports home. So Cromwell began, quietly and with his usual patience, to construct a case out of the ordinary raw material a royal court always provided. He watched the young men who moved in and out of the Queen's rooms, the musicians, the gentlemen of the Privy Chamber, the courtiers who flirted and flattered and wrote overly romantic poetry to a queen, because flirting with the Queen through courtly verse was a familiar game that everyone at court played, and nobody was meant to take seriously. In a household full of ambitious young men, and a queen famous for her sharp wit, there was always raw material lying around waiting to be shaped into something else. And Cromwell was, above almost everything else, a master at turning the entirely ordinary into the seemingly damning. Toward the end of April, a young court musician named Mark Smeaton was quietly detained and taken to a house in Stepney for questioning. Smeaton was low-born, gifted, vain, and almost entirely without protection. No powerful family at court, no great patron, nobody who would raise so much as a finger if he simply disappeared. He was exactly the sort of person Cromwell's process was designed to break, and it broke him completely, under interrogation, almost certainly involving some form of coercion. The official record is careful never to name directly. Smeaton confessed that he had been the Queen's lover. It was a lie, very likely squeezed out of a terrified young man who would have confessed to anything at all to make the questioning stop. But it was the first brick laid, and once it was in place, the rest of the wall could be built on top of it. Anne, back in her rooms at Greenwich, knew nothing of any of this. She was still occupied navigating the daily humiliations of her collapsing position, still half believing she might yet claw her way back into her husband's good graces, if only she could find the right words. The last days of that April, from where she sat, felt almost ordinary. She played with Elizabeth. She spoke with her chaplain. She slept badly and lay awake through the early hours of the morning. And the floor beneath her had already given way. knowledge shifting. The last ordinary evening, on the 30th of April, the last remaining pretense of an ordinary marriage shattered out in the open, where everyone could see it. Anne and Henry were together at Greenwich, and the argument that broke between them was overheard by servants in the next room and by courtiers passing through the corridor. Anyone close enough caught the sharp edges of two raised voices cutting through the afternoon air. Anne had Elizabeth with her that day, a red-haired girl of 2.5. There is an account, difficult to picture without a certain ache, in which Anne is said to have stood in a courtyard below the king's open window, holding the little girl up toward him, pleading not for herself any more, but for the child they had made together. Henry looked down at the two of them and said nothing anyone could later repair, and turned away from the window. Whatever exactly passed between them in that moment, it marked the end. He rode for London that evening without saying goodbye to her. She never saw him again. The following morning was the 1st of May, traditionally a day of old celebration across England, and the court had gathered at Greenwich for the customary May Day jousts. The lists had been dressed with banners. Henry was fully in his element, surrounded by his knights, immersed in the roar of the crowd and the thunder of horses on the tilt-yard. Anne sat in the royal viewing gallery, dressed for the occasion, her face composed, watching her own brother George ride against the king's close friend Henry Norris in the tournament below. She knew on some level that something was wrong. The argument of the previous day, the strange, tense currents moving through the household, the faces around her that would not quite meet her eyes. But she did not yet know the shape of what was coming. As the jousting continued, a messenger reached the king. Henry read something, or heard something spoken quietly at his ear, and his whole manner changed in an instant. He rose abruptly, left the tournament without a single word to his own queen, and rode away toward London with a small, hard-faced group of companions. Among the men riding at his side, already being quietly questioned as they went, was Henry Norris himself. Anne was left sitting alone in the gallery, the jousts continuing beneath her, as though nothing had happened, the eyes of the assembled court sliding toward her and quickly away again. A queen does not flee a public spectacle, whatever she may privately suspect, so she remained in her seat until she could leave with proper dignity, and only then returned to her apartments. She did not sleep that night. The rhythm of the palace had gone wrong in ways she could feel, but not yet name. Guards stood in places guards had never stood before. Arrest, in the early hours of the 2nd of May, the door to her chambers opened, and the men she least wished to see walked through it. She was arrested. The charges were read aloud to her: adultery with several named men, incest with her own brother, and conspiring with her supposed lovers to bring about the death of the king. Treason of every variety the law could possibly name. Anne listened. She did not collapse. She asked to see the king, and was told it was impossible. She asked whether she was to be taken to the Tower, and was told that she was. They carried her there by barge down the Thames, along the same broad grey river she had travelled in triumph, almost exactly 3 years earlier, on her way to be crowned. Picture it as she must have lived it. You are seated in a covered barge on the river. You know better than any road in England, and the oars are dipping and rising, and the same familiar banks slide past that slid past on the brightest morning of your entire life. You went up this water once beneath a canopy of cloth of gold, to the sound of guns fired in your honor and a mechanical dragon breathing painted flame. You are going down it now under armed guard, and the guns are silent, and the tower is rising up out of the haze ahead of you. And you have stayed inside those walls once before, in the royal apartments reserved for a monarch on the night before her coronation. You understand, watching the Watergate grow larger, that you are returning to those very same rooms, not as a queen on the eve of her crowning, as a prisoner a fortnight before her death. And the terrible symmetry of it, the same river, the same fortress, very possibly the same rooms, is a thought your clever mind cannot stop turning over, no matter how much you would give to make it stop turning. When the barge landed, and Anne stepped out onto the cobblestones, the constable of the tower, Sir William Kingston, was waiting to receive her. He was a seasoned soldier who had watched a great many frightened people pass through that gate over the years, and he was, by most accounts, not a cruel man. He treated her throughout with careful formality, continuing to address her as the Queen, even though the very charges laid against her denied she had any right to that title at all. She was taken up into the royal lodgings, the very rooms she had occupied on the night before her coronation, 3 years and 11 months earlier, and she understood immediately, with total clarity, exactly where she was. She sank to her knees on the stone floor and asked Kingston whether she was to be placed in a dungeon. He told her no, that she would have the Queen's own lodgings. She laughed at that, a strange, cracked sound, and said it was far too good for her. Then she asked whether her father had been taken, and whether her brother had been taken. Kingston, under strict orders, would not answer either question. She asked whether she was going to die. He told her only that the poorest subject the king possessed was in God's hands, and so now was she. The letters from the tower, what followed, were among the strangest days of Anne Boleyn's entire life, and they are documented more intimately than almost any other stretch of her existence, because William Kingston was required, as part of his duty, to write regularly to Cromwell and report everything the Queen said and did. Those letters survive today, damaged in places, incomplete in others, but genuinely astonishing. They preserve the voice of a woman in the grip of mortal terror, trying to make sense of the senseless, recorded by a jailer who had become, in the strange, forced intimacy of those rooms, something close to her final confidant. In the first hours, she was frantic, talking almost without pause, veering rapidly from terror to wild, nervous laughter to prayer, and back to terror again. She asked repeatedly after the men named in the charges against her. She asked where Norris was, and Weston, and Brereton. She asked, over and over, whether her brother George had been taken, and Kingston noted the particular sharpness of fear in that specific question, because George had indeed been arrested and was somewhere inside that same fortress, held on the charge of having committed incest with his own sister. The word itself seemed to hang in the air between them, too large and too foul to feel entirely real. At other moments, she was almost giddy, the strange, brittle giddiness that extreme fear sometimes produces. She made a grim joke that ran through the tower and eventually out into the city and down into the written chronicles, that they would soon be calling her Queen Anne Lackhead, since the sword would take her cleanly, and she would suffer only a moment. She put her own hands around her throat as she said it, and laughed. Kingston, watching her, wrote that the lady seemed to find a strange joy and pleasure in contemplating her own death, though it is plain from his account that what he was actually witnessing was a mind trying to strip the thing of its power by nomming it out loud, again and again, until the nomming itself stopped hurting quite so much. She talked almost unstoppably about the men, and in doing so, without meaning to, handed the prosecution some of its most useful material. She told Kingston the story of a conversation she had once had with Henry Norris, in which she had teasingly asked him why he did not simply go ahead and marry the woman he was courting. And Norris had given some evasive answer about being in no particular hurry. Exasperated, Anne had snapped back that he must be waiting for dead men's shoes, meaning that if any harm ever came to the king, Norris would expect to have her. It had been a reckless, foolish thing to have said even as a joke, because it put into actual words the single idea the entire indictment against her would come to rest on, that the queen and the men around her had imagined, however idly, a world in which the king was already dead. She seemed to understand, even as she recounted the story to Kingston, exactly how it would be used against her. She could not seem to stop herself from telling it anyway. The circle widens. The arrests spread outward. Sir Francis Weston, young, handsome, a genuine favorite at court, was taken. So was William Brereton, a wealthy and hard-edged gentleman from Cheshire with a long list of personal enemies who found his sudden removal enormously convenient. The poet Thomas Wyatt was taken as well, though Wyatt, who had loved Anne years before and written poems about her that anyone at court could read the true meaning of, would in the end be released without ever standing trial, protected, for reasons of his own, by Cromwell. The pattern in all of it was becoming clear to anyone paying attention. This was never simply about proving the queen guilty of adultery. It was about sweeping up, in one coordinated motion, the entire circle of men around her, whose removal happened to suit the new political order taking shape. The cruelest stroke of all was reserved for her brother. The charge against George Boleyn was not merely that he had spent too much time alone in his sister's company. It was stated plainly, incest, that the Queen had drawn her own brother into her bed, that the two of them had done the unspeakable together, and that George might even be the true father of one of the children she had previously lost. The accusation was monstrous, and it was designed to be monstrous, because Cromwell understood the mechanics of public belief with unnerving precision. An ordinary accusation of adultery with a court musician might reasonably be doubted by a skeptical audience. But an accusation this grotesque, this far outside the boundaries of anything a normal person could imagine doing, risked making, and appear not merely sinful, but genuinely unnatural. A creature standing entirely outside the human pale. And if the watching public could be brought to believe that particular horror about her, they would believe almost anything else said about her afterward. George Boleyn was 27 years old, bright, cultivated, a poet and a diplomat, and his sister's closest ally in the entire world. And now he was to be dragged onto the very same scaffold as a means of destroying her more completely and more permanently than a simple adultery charge ever could have managed on its own. At some point during those first days in the Tower, a letter was supposedly composed and sent from Anne to the king. A letter of extraordinary pride mixed with equally extraordinary desperation, protesting her innocence, reminding Henry of everything the two of them had once been to each other, asking only for a fair and open trial, and begging him, if he was truly determined to be rid of her, to at least spare the innocent men caught in the net alongside her. Whether Anne genuinely wrote it herself, historians have argued about for centuries since. The original document does not survive. But whoever composed it, it was never answered. She looked around at the court she had, in effect, once ruled, and found that it had simply emptied out around her. The friends who had surrounded her during her triumph had quietly melted away. The reformers she had personally raised up kept their heads down and said nothing in her defense. The very courtiers who had flattered her openly a month earlier were already learning the shortest, safest route to Jane Seymour's rooms. Even her own uncle, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, the greatest of all the Howards, and the man who would soon preside over her trial, made it unmistakably plain that he intended to do his duty to the king long before he did anything at all for his niece. Anne had always understood, in theory, that blood counted for far less than survival at a court like this one. Learning that lesson in theory, and then living it out from inside a locked stone cell, turned out to be two entirely different things. The men are tried first. The men were tried first on the 12th of May, and that ordering was no accident. Norris, Weston, Brereton, and Smeaton, the four commoners named in the indictment, were arraigned together in Westminster Hall, several days ahead of the trial of the Queen and her brother. The logic behind the sequencing was cold and deliberate. If the men were convicted of adultery with her, then her own guilt would already be effectively established before she ever set foot inside a courtroom. She would be standing trial for a crime a jury had, in practical terms, already ruled had taken place. It was an elegant piece of legal engineering, and it worked precisely as designed. Smeaton, who had already confessed under interrogation, pleaded guilty. The other three, Norris, the king's own old friend, Weston, the golden young courtier everyone at court seemed fond of, Brereton, the tough Cheshire gentleman with a long list of enemies, all pleaded not guilty and denied every charge against them. It made no difference whatsoever to the outcome. There was a story afterward that Weston's wealthy family offered an enormous sum of money for his life, and that foreign merchants added to the offer, pushing it as high as a genuine fortune, and that the offer was refused outright because these men were never being tried in order to be spared. All four were condemned to a traitor's death. The verdict against them sealed the verdict against Anne 2 full days before her own trial had even begun. Inside the great hall of the Tower, on the morning of the 15th of May, the door of Anne's lodging opened, and she was told it was time. Her trial and her brother's were held not at Westminster, but inside the Tower itself, in the great hall, the very same vast room where she had once dined in royal state on the night before her coronation, when those same walls had been hung with tapestry for a queen. Now the hall had been rebuilt into a courtroom, fitted with a raised platform for the judges and rows of benches for spectators. Some 2,000 people had been granted admission to watch nobles, officials, foreign ambassadors. A carefully selected audience who would carry the story of what they witnessed back out into the wider world. The man presiding over the court was her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, one of the most powerful men in England, and a survivor of every political storm the age had thrown at him. He had absolutely no intention of risking his own neck for a niece who had, by every visible sign, already lost. He took his seat at the center of the platform, his expression giving away nothing at all, and called the court to order. The indictment was read aloud, and it was a document of staggering scope and lurid, almost theatrical specificity. Anne was formally accused of adultery with 5 men, including her own brother. It listed exact dates and exact locations, naming the very palaces where the Queen was said to have taken each of her supposed lovers to bed. It claimed she had openly mocked the king's manhood with her lovers, laughed at his poetry, promised to marry one of them the moment he was dead, and actively conspired with them to hasten that death along. It was a tower of accusation built brick upon brick, and to anyone who actually knew the Queen's real movements during the dates listed, several of the claims were simply impossible. A number of the alleged encounters were dated to days when Anne was demonstrably somewhere else entirely. In one instance, still confined to her bed, recovering from childbirth. In another, in full public view of the entire court for hours at a stretch. The men who had drawn up the indictment had not troubled themselves to check a calendar. They had not needed to. Her own defense. Anne was brought in wearing plain black, her dark hair drawn back, her face visibly pale after a fortnight in the Tower, but her spine straight and her eyes clear. She had no lawyer. Under Tudor treason law, the accused was permitted none. She had to answer, entirely alone, to a panel of 26 peers of the realm, every last one of them selected for the purpose, every last one of them either genuinely her enemy or far too frightened to appear as anything but one. And she defended herself. Eyewitnesses present in that hall, including several who held no particular affection for her at all, recorded afterward that she answered the charges with a clarity and a composure that visibly unsettled the room. She spoke calmly. She denied each accusation in turn, methodically. When her own remark to Norris about dead men's shoes was read back to her, she explained it for exactly what it had been, a foolish, idle, exasperated joke, not a plot against the king's life. When the charge of adultery with the servant Smeaton was raised, she pointed out that she had exchanged only a handful of words with him in her entire life, had never once been alone with him, and could not account for his confession, except to suggest that he must have been terrified or coerced into giving it, which was, in fact, exactly the truth. And when the charge of incest with her own brother was put to her directly, she did not waver for even an instant. She said, loudly enough for the entire hall to hear, that these things were lies. She answered with such clarity and such visible presence of mind that several observers wrote afterward that had the verdict genuinely depended on the evidence presented, she would have walked out of that hall a free woman. But the verdict never depended on the evidence. It had been settled long before she ever entered the room. George Boleyn's defiance. George Boleyn was tried immediately after his sister, and he defended himself with the same cool, composed skill she had shown. So effectively that men in the hall reportedly began quietly laying bets that he would be acquitted outright. Then the prosecution played a card in the most literal sense possible. There was a piece of evidence considered too indecent to be read aloud in open court. So it was written instead on a small slip of paper and handed directly to George, with instructions that he confine his answer to a simple yes or no. It concerned something his own wife was said to have reported, that Anne had allegedly told her the king was incapable of satisfying a woman, that he lacked both the vigor and the skill for it. The implication was doubly dangerous. It suggested that the Queen and her circle had been openly gossiping about the king's failures in bed, and it hinted, unmistakably, at the far more explosive possibility that Elizabeth might not be Henry's daughter at all. George Boleyn looked at the slip of paper, understood immediately and precisely what reading it aloud would cost him, and did it anyway, deliberately, in a full, clear voice, in front of the entire assembled hall. It was an act of open defiance from a man who understood by that point that he was almost certainly going to die regardless of what he said or did not say, and who had apparently decided he would not help the court quietly hide its own indecency. It changed nothing about the sentence that followed. But in its own way, it was magnificent. Guilty. The peers withdrew to deliberate, and they did not stay away long. When they filed back in, each man rose in turn and delivered his verdict, one after another down the long rows of benches. Guilty, guilty, guilty. 26 voices, all returning the same single word, entirely unanimous. Among them, forced to pronounce the verdict along with the rest, sat Henry Percy, the very same Henry Percy who, a dozen years earlier, had secretly promised to marry Anne before Cardinal Wolsey tore them apart. He is said to have been so overwhelmed as the trial wore on that he had to be physically helped from the hall. He gave his guilty verdict all the same before he left. Anne received the verdict standing, still in her black gown, without shedding a single visible tear. She did not protest. She simply stood and let her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, pronounce the sentence. And he, reading the law aloud, wept as he did it, or came very close to it. The lawful punishment for a woman convicted of high treason was to be burned alive at the stake. Or, if the king in his mercy chose to permit it, to be beheaded instead. Which of the two it would be was left, deliberately, entirely to Henry's discretion. When Anne was finally allowed to speak, she said, in effect, that she was prepared to die, but that she was deeply sorry other innocent and loyal people would die because of her. Then she was led back to her lodging to wait. The wait would last 5 days. Henry chose the sword. It was presented publicly as an act of mercy, and in the narrowest possible sense, it was a single clean stroke instead of the horror of burning, or even the ordinary brutality of an axe, which in unskilled hands could take 3 or 4 blows to finish the job. But it was also, characteristically for Henry, a matter of carefully managing appearances. He sent all the way to Calais for a professional headsman, a man who worked not with a block and axe, but with a heavy, 2-handed sword, reputed across the continent to be swift and exact. And here is the single detail that reveals exactly how much of a genuine trial this trial had ever really been. The swordsman of Calais was summoned before the verdict had even been formally handed down. The order for his passage across the channel went out, while Anne was still, technically, only an accused woman awaiting judgment. The instrument of her death was already crossing the water while she was still standing in her uncle's courtroom, defending her own life with every ounce of composure she had left. Tower Hill, the men died first. On the 17th of May, on Tower Hill, George Boleyn and the 4 other condemned men were beheaded one after another, in front of a crowd gathered to watch. George went first, granted the small, grim dignity of dying before the men accused of adultery with his own sister. Not far away, shut inside the bell tower, the poet Thomas Wyatt watched the executions unfold through a narrow window. He had known most of these men personally. He had once loved the woman they were now dying on her behalf for, And out of that window, in the days that followed, he wrote some of the bleakest lines in the English language about sudden violence, living close to a throne, about a bloody season that had broken something in him permanently, about the way thunder seems to circle endlessly around a crown, about men he had seen standing so impossibly high who were now simply gone. Wyatt himself survived. He was quietly released some weeks later, but he never wrote about the spring of 1536 as anything other than an open wound. That same day, the 17th of May, Thomas Cranmer came to the Tower. He did not come to offer Anne comfort, though he may privately have wished to. He came to formally dissolve her marriage. In a small, private ceremony held with Anne present, the Archbishop of Canterbury pronounced that the union between Henry and Anne had been, and had always been, null and void from the very beginning. The precise legal grounds were never made public, and the document itself has since been lost or deliberately destroyed. But the most likely explanation, and a bitter one, is that Henry's earlier affair with Anne's own sister Mary had created, under church law, an impediment of affinity. The very same kind of impediment Henry had spent 7 exhausting years arguing had made his marriage to Catherine invalid in the first place. If that truly was the stated ground, the logic underneath it was savage and complete. If Henry's relationship with Mary Boleyn had made his marriage to Anne void from the start, then Anne had never actually been his lawful wife, had never actually been queen. And Elizabeth, the bright, red-haired girl growing up at Hatfield, was, in the eyes of the law, a bastard. Of all the men in this story, Cranmer is perhaps the hardest to sit with, because he was not, by any honest account, a monster, and he plainly did not want to be doing any of this. Anne had made his entire career. She had lifted him from a modest Cambridge fellowship all the way to the highest office the English Church had to offer. He owed her his position, and in a very real sense, his entire life's work, the Reformed Church he genuinely believed in. And when she fell, he wrote to Henry a letter that remains almost unbearable to read today. One that tries, in the very same breath, to remain loyal to his king, while also being just to his friend. He wrote that he was utterly amazed, that he had never held a higher opinion of any woman than he had held of her, that next to the king himself, he felt more indebted to her than to any living soul, and that, in his own heart, he could not believe her guilty. And then, having written all of that, he bent, exactly as everyone else in this story eventually bent, and did precisely what the king required of him. He dissolved the marriage of the woman to whom he owed almost everything. 2 days before her death, he privately kept his belief in her innocence, and he kept his own head on his shoulders, and he lived out the rest of a long life, carrying the full knowledge of exactly what it had cost him to keep both. A mother's grief. Anne received the news of the annulment, and that, finally, was the thing that broke through her composure. She had held herself together through the arrest, the imprisonment, the trial, the verdict, the sentence itself, but the knowledge that her daughter was, at that very moment, being formally stripped of her royal title. That Elizabeth would now grow up, branded a bastard. That the one child Anne had fought so hard, and so publicly, to protect, was being cast down alongside her. That reached a place inside her that nothing else had managed to touch. She wept. Kingston recorded that she wept specifically for her daughter, insisting through the tears that the girl was a princess born, and that nothing and no one could ever truly take that from her. But they could take it. They had already taken it. Elizabeth was no longer a princess, and Anne was no longer a wife, and there was nothing left to fight for any more except the manner in which it would all finally end. And once there was truly nothing left to fight for, a strange calm settled back over her. The worst of it had already happened. She asked for the blessed sacrament to be kept in her own chamber, so she could pray before it in the hours remaining to her. And she did something that mattered enormously to her, and that ought to matter to anyone hearing this story now. In the presence of Kingston, she received the sacrament, and she swore on it, on the damnation of her own immortal soul, twice. Once before receiving it, and once again after, that she had never once been unfaithful to the king. For a believing woman of the 16th century, an oath sworn on the body of Christ, at the very edge of death, was the single most binding act a human being could perform. To swear it falsely, in that moment, was to choose damnation deliberately, with the last free act available to her. She swore it knowing there was no earthly court left to hear any appeal, no judge who would reverse the sentence, no king who would ride to save her. She swore it because it was true, and because she wanted that truth to exist somewhere in the permanent record, even if not a single soul alive that week was inclined to believe her. The last night, the execution was set for the morning of the 19th of May, inside the walls of the tower itself, on the green before the chapel, not the public killing ground of Tower Hill, where crowds gathered to jeer at ordinary traitors, but a smaller, quieter space reserved for prisoners of rank, whose deaths the king did not wish turned into a spectacle he could not fully control. There was a delay of 1 full day. The original date passed, and Kingston reported that the Queen seemed genuinely distressed by the postponement, not out of fear of death itself, but because she had already steeled herself completely for it, and simply wished the whole thing finished. She told him she had expected to be dead by then, and past her pain. She was, in her own words, ready before her executioners were. She spent her final night in prayer, together with her almoner and the 4 women who had been assigned to attend her throughout the entire ordeal, and who had become, in the strange, forced closeness of that cell, her last true companions in the world. Picture it in the final, quiet hours before dawn. You have been awake a long time, and you find, somewhat to your own surprise, that you are not, in the end, afraid in the way you always imagined you would be. You have made your confession. You have sworn your innocence upon the body of your God, which is the last true thing left in your possession, and you have already given it freely. Your women move quietly around you in the dark, weeping whenever they believe you cannot hear them. In a few hours, they will dress you, and you have already decided exactly what you will wear, because you have never once in your life been careless about your appearance, and you are certainly not going to start now, on this particular morning. And somewhere in the dark, you find yourself thinking of the girl at Hatfield, too young to understand any of this, who will grow up being told, by people who never knew the truth, that her mother was a monster. And you decide, lying there in the dark, the single most important thing you will decide all morning, that whatever words you speak on that scaffold, in front of all those watching eyes, you will say absolutely nothing that could ever be turned into a weapon against her. The morning, the light came early on the 19th, pale and thin, through the narrow windows of her chamber. Her women dressed her with exactly the care she had asked for. She put on a kirtle of deep red, the color of blood, and in the old faith, the color of martyrdom. A quiet statement for anyone in the crowd with eyes sharp enough to read it. Over it went a gown of dark gray damask trimmed with fur, and over her dark hair, that same famous French hood that had scandalized and delighted the English court 15 years earlier. The same hood that had marked her out, from the very first day she wore it, as different, as foreign, as unmistakably herself. She wore no elaborate jewels. She did not need them. Kingston came for her at 8 in the morning. He found her already composed, standing quietly at the center of the room, her women weeping softly behind her. She asked him whether it would hurt. He told her the swordsman brought over from Calais was extremely skilled, and that it would be finished in a single moment. She put her own hands to her throat and said that she had heard he was very good, and that she had, after all, only a little neck to take, and she laughed. Not the cracked, frantic laughter of her first days locked in the tower. Something lighter than that, something closer to relief. The laughter of a woman who had, at last, finished being afraid. The walk out to the green was short, a few hundred paces, and it took her past the small chapel of St. Peter, where the bodies of the previously executed already lay beneath the stone floor. She would have known, walking past it, that she would be inside it herself within the hour, not as a worshipper this time, but as a body waiting for the floor to be lifted. She did not pause. She kept walking. On the green, a low scaffold had been built and draped entirely in black, with fresh straw scattered across the platform to take the blood. A crowd of perhaps 1,000 people had been admitted by invitation. Nobles, city officials, the Lord Mayor of London, foreign diplomats, already composing the letters they would send home describing exactly what they saw. Thomas Cromwell was there, watching. The ordinary people of London. The same people who had stood in silence at her coronation 3 years earlier, waited outside the walls, unable to enter. The swordsman waited on the scaffold, dressed not in an executioner's traditional apron, but in plain, sober clothing, his weapon deliberately hidden in the straw at his feet, out of her direct line of sight, so that she would not have to look at it as she climbed the steps. The speech on the scaffold. Anne climbed the steps and turned to face the assembled crowd. By every surviving account, she was entirely calm. She asked leave to speak, and it was granted, and the whole green fell silent. Her speech was brief, no more than a handful of sentences, and every single word of it had clearly been weighed and chosen in advance. She did not argue against the sentence. She did not protest her innocence. Not there, not from that scaffold, because she understood perfectly well that a dying woman's public accusation against the king, spoken in front of 2,000 listening ears, would fall directly onto her daughter's head within the week. So instead, she said that she had come there to die, as she stood condemned under the law, and that she would accuse no one and speak against nothing. She asked the crowd to pray for the king, and she called him the very man who had ordered this scaffold built for her, a good and gentle and sovereign lord, as merciful a prince as had ever lived. It was, of course, a lie, and everyone standing on that green that morning knew perfectly well it was a lie. She told it anyway, deliberately, with her last remaining minutes, because she had a 2-year-old daughter who was going to have to live out her whole life inside this particular man's kingdom. And a curse hurled from a scaffold was a luxury no mother in her position could possibly afford. She commended her soul to God, asked the onlookers for their prayers, and was finished speaking. Her women came forward, weeping, to take her hood and her gown from her. She handed everything over the way a person might hand things to a maid at the end of an entirely ordinary evening, and she tucked her own hair carefully up under a small linen cap, so that her neck was fully bare. She knelt down in the straw. She would not be blindfolded at first, though someone eventually tied the cloth for her. And now the swordsman performed one final, merciful, and terrible act. Knowing she would instinctively flinch if she caught any sight of the blow coming toward her, he called out loudly to a boy standing nearby, to no one in particular, asking for his sword, though the sword was already resting in his own hands, purely so that, in the last instant, her head would turn slightly the other way. Picture the very end of it, if you can bear to. You are kneeling in the straw, your eyes bound in cloth, and you can feel the cool morning air against the bare skin of your neck. You are repeating the same words over and over, the only words left to you now, the ones you decided upon in the darkness of the night before. To Jesus Christ, I commend my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my soul. To Jesus Christ, I commend my soul. And you hear a voice call out somewhere off to your right, and your head turns, just slightly, toward the sound, without your ever quite deciding to. And that is the very last thing. The small, involuntary turning of your head toward a voice. You never feel anything that comes after. It was one clean stroke. Witnesses standing closest to the scaffold said afterward that her lips appeared to still be moving in prayer for a moment, even after. Then her women rushed forward with a white cloth to cover what remained, No one, it turned out, had thought to provide a coffin for a Queen of England. An attendant eventually found an old elm chest that had previously been used to store arrows, long, narrow, entirely unceremonial. Anne Boleyn's body was folded into it, and her head placed beside it. The chest was carried the short distance to the chapel of St. Peter, and buried beneath the stone floor near the altar, without any formal service, without a marker, without so much as her name recorded anywhere on the site. On the wall of the tower, a single cannon fired, the agreed signal to the king that it was finally done. Henry, who had spent that particular morning at another of his palaces, some distance away, heard the distant report of the gun, and the story goes that he simply called for his hunting dogs and rode out into the fields. He was already, that same day, dressed for a wedding. He would be formally betrothed to Jane Seymour the very next morning, and married to her within a fortnight. Anne Boleyn was gone, 1,036 days after that silent, unwelcoming coronation, a child who did not yet understand. But her life does not stop mattering the moment the body itself stops. And Anne had left something behind her that would go on to outlast every single person who had condemned her. Her daughter was still at Hatfield, far too young to understand any of what had happened. The servants would have kept the news from her for as long as they possibly could, but even a child of 2.5 can sense when the ground beneath a household has shifted. Almost overnight, the household of the Princess Elizabeth became simply the household of the Lady Elizabeth. A bastard, a girl with no title left, and an entirely uncertain future. There is a small, sharp detail that survives from those weeks. Elizabeth's governess wrote in some visible distress to Thomas Cromwell, asking what the child was supposed to wear, because Elizabeth had already outgrown her current clothes, and nobody seemed entirely sure anymore who was responsible for paying to replace them. The girl who had, only weeks earlier, been the recognized heir of England was, for one strange season, reduced to little more than a problem of unpaid laundry bills. She kept being educated regardless, because her tutors believed in educating even their most politically inconvenient charges. But those same tutors noticed a change settling over her as she grew older. She became watchful. She learned, early and thoroughly, to guard her own tongue and to keep her real thoughts carefully hidden behind an unreadable face. The very same armor her mother had built for herself in France, at almost exactly the same age, for almost exactly the same reasons. The fates of the living. Henry moved on with what most observers considered unseemly speed. He married Jane Seymour just 11 days after the sword fell, in a small, quiet ceremony. And Jane gave him, at last, the one thing Anne had died for failing to provide, a living son. Edward was born in the autumn of 1537. 12 days after that birth, Jane Seymour died of childbed fever. Henry, who had discarded 2 wives already without so much as a backward glance, appears to have genuinely mourned this particular one, deeply enough that, years later, he asked to be buried beside her. The quiet one, the one who never raised her voice. She is the wife whose grave he ultimately chose to share for eternity. Thomas Cromwell, who had personally built the machine that destroyed Anne Boleyn, enjoyed his victory for roughly 4 more years. He was elevated to Earl of Essex. He completed the dissolution of the monasteries and grew immensely wealthy in the process. And then he arranged Henry's 4th marriage to Anne of Cleves, a match the king found so personally distasteful that it lasted barely 6 months and curdled into a lasting grudge against the man who had engineered it. In the summer of 1540, Cromwell himself was arrested on charges of treason and heresy and taken to the very same tower where Anne had spent her final days. He wrote frantic letters to Henry, begging for mercy, protesting his loyalty, almost exactly as Anne had done before him, and to precisely the same effect. He was beheaded on Tower Hill that July, and in an ugly accident, or perhaps a deliberate cruelty, the axeman assigned to the task was clumsy, requiring several blows to finish the job, a far messier death than the clean French sword he himself had once arranged for the woman he destroyed. The chroniclers of the time noticed the symmetry and did not particularly bother to hide their satisfaction at it. There is one more turn of that same grim wheel worth noting. Jane Parker, Lady Rochford, George Boleyn's own widow, had given evidence that helped send both her husband and her sister-in-law to the block. Some of the poisonous gossip about what Anne had supposedly said regarding the king's manhood is believed to have originated with her. She lived on afterward, rose again at court, and became a lady-in-waiting to Henry's 5th wife, the young Catherine Howard, who happened to be, as it turned out, another of Anne Boleyn's own cousins. When Catherine Howard fell in 1542 on charges of adultery that this time appear to have actually been true, Lady Rochford fell alongside her for having helped arrange the young queen's secret meetings. She was executed on Tower Green, on the very same spot where Anne had died 6 years earlier. The 2 Boleyn cousins, the 2 beheaded queens, now lie near one another beneath the same chapel floor. Thomas Boleyn, the father who had once sent his clever daughter off into the courts of Europe and watched her climb higher than he could ever reasonably have dreamed, and who then watched her and his only son destroyed within the span of a single week, withdrew entirely from public life and died in 1539, his great family project lying in ruins around him. Elizabeth Howard, Anne's mother, had died the year before. Neither parent lived to see what would ultimately become of the granddaughter left behind at Hatfield. The astonishing fact, because Elizabeth survived. That is the single most astonishing fact sitting at the center of this entire story. The girl declared a bastard at 2 years old lived through the remainder of her father's marriages. She lived through the short reign of her half-brother Edward and through the reign of her half-sister Mary, who at one point imprisoned her for a time in the very same tower where their father's marital quarrels had once claimed a queen's life. Elizabeth is said to have refused, at first, to enter through the water gate on that occasion, sitting down instead on the wet stone steps in the pouring rain rather than walk in like a common traitor. She survived that too, and in November of 1558, when Mary died childless, the crown finally came down to the last Tudor still standing. Anne Boleyn's daughter became Elizabeth I, Queen of England, 25 years old. Her reign would go on to last 44 years. It gave the English language Shakespeare and Marlowe. It defeated the Spanish Armada. It transformed a damp, second-rate island kingdom into something the rest of Europe had no choice but to take seriously. And the woman who accomplished all of that was the same furious, red-haired infant whose birth had been such a bitter disappointment that her own father had canceled a tournament in response. She carried her mother with her, quietly, for her entire life. She almost never spoke of Anne in public. To do so openly would have meant admitting, in effect, that her own father had murdered an innocent woman, and the entire Tudor claim to legitimacy rested on the unspoken fiction that Henry had never been wrong about anything. But she wore a ring, a beautiful locket ring that opened to reveal two tiny portraits hidden inside. One was of Elizabeth herself. The other, facing it, was of a dark-haired woman historians are now almost universally certain was Anne Boleyn. The Queen of England wore her disgraced, beheaded mother's image against her own hand in secret for decades, and told almost no one. She quietly promoted her surviving Boleyn relatives, drew them close to court, and favored the descendants of her aunt, Mary Boleyn. She kept the memory alive in 100 small, unspoken gestures, without ever once saying the thing directly out loud. What was erased, and what survived anyway? Other traces of Anne survived, despite what was clearly a deliberate campaign to erase her entirely from public memory. Her portraits were taken down and destroyed after her death, so thoroughly that we can no longer say with any real certainty what she truly looked like. The familiar image most people picture today, the dark-haired woman in the French hood, a small gold pendant at her throat, is a copy of a copy, painted long after her death, an impression rather than any kind of true likeness. Her personal badges were chiseled off the palace walls, wherever they could be found. And yet, a small book of hours she is said to have carried came down through the centuries, with a line of verse written in her own hand inside it, dating from the days when she and Henry were still exchanging love notes across a chapel, long before any of this had happened. In 1876, during repair work being carried out inside the chapel of St. Peter within the tower, workmen lifted the stone floor near the altar and found a jumble of old bones, and among them the remains of a slender woman, buried without any ceremony, in exactly the spot the historical records indicated Anne had been laid to rest. The Victorian investigators who examined the remains concluded, based on the available evidence, that they had indeed found her. She was properly reinterred this time, beneath a marked stone bearing her name. If you visit the chapel today, you can stand over that small square of floor and know that whatever is left of her has, at long last, been given a name to rest beneath. The verdict of 5 centuries, the verdict of history, after 5 centuries of argument, is really no longer seriously in doubt. Anne Boleyn was innocent of every crime that killed her. The adultery, the incest, the plot against the king's life, all of it manufactured on impossible dates, built out of a confession squeezed from a terrified, tortured young man, and a handful of reckless words spoken in a moment of exasperation. She was the victim of a calculated political killing, engineered by Thomas Cromwell, and signed off by a king who wanted a different wife, and, above all, a living son. She was not a saint. She could be sharp, imperious, vindictive, and at moments disastrously careless with her own tongue. She made enemies faster than almost anyone could count, and she forgave them slowly, if she forgave them at all. Men she personally despised went to their deaths defying an oath she herself had helped bring into existence. All of that is entirely true, and this account does her no honor by pretending otherwise. But none of it made her a traitor. None of it made her an adulteress. And none of it means she deserved to die on a quiet spring morning, kneeling in straw, beneath a borrowed sword. What she leaves behind is not really a moral lesson. It is a set of specific, stubborn facts, and they can simply be stated plainly and allowed to stand as what they are. She refused, for 6 long years, to become a king's mistress, and in refusing, she changed the official religion of an entire nation. She placed a banned book into the hands of the most powerful man in England, and pointed him, deliberately, away from Rome. She was crowned in silence, and buried in a chest built to hold arrows. She was the mother of the greatest ruler her country would ever produce, and she never lived to know it, never saw a single minute of it, because she was dead at somewhere between 29 and 36 years old. And we still cannot agree, after all this time, on precisely which. She has been arguing with us about the details of her own life from the far side of the grave for 500 years now, and she shows no particular sign of stopping. A story the Tower guards still tell. There is a story the guards at the Tower of London still tell quietly on slow evenings after the last visitors have gone home, and the resident ravens have settled for the night, and the final light is fading off the river. They say the old fortress keeps its ghosts, and that one of them is a woman in a gray gown who is sometimes seen walking the corridor where the royal lodgings used to stand, that she does not scream, and she does not weep, but only walks over and over the short path from the rooms where she once prayed to the small green where she eventually knelt. Whether there is any truth to such things, no one can really say. But it is worth noting that if any single life in English history has earned the right to refuse to stay quietly buried, to keep walking that same short path through the dark, daring the living to look directly at her and say, honestly, what was actually done to her. It is very likely this one. She kept her word on that scaffold. She said nothing that could ever be turned into a weapon against her daughter. And her daughter lived and reigned and wore her mother's face in a secret ring against her own hand for 44 years. Is the detail worth carrying with you as you drift off tonight? Not the crown and not the sword. A woman alone in the dark, in the last free hours she would ever have, deciding that the very last thing she would do with her life was protect a 2-year-old girl who could not yet understand any of it, and then doing exactly that perfectly in front of 2,000 watching strangers with a carefully chosen lie. It was the last thing she was ever able to give to anyone in this world, and she gave it, and it worked. The night has grown deep around us now. The fire has burned low. You have walked with her the whole way from the ducks paddling on the moat at Hever to the glittering courts of Burgundy and France, to the terrible silence of a coronation, to the deeper silence of a scaffold. You have watched her rise and love and lose and win nearly everything, and then lose all of it again in the space of a single spring. There is nothing left of the story to tell, so you can let her rest now